welcome to Dragon Slaying 101. Now, I wanted to start by kind of talking a little bit about dragons. There are a lot of mythological stories from all over the world that involve a hero going out and slaying a dragon. And we're going to look at one of those stories. It's called the story of St. George and the Dragon. Now, I guarantee you've probably heard this story even if you don't know how it goes. Once upon a time, there was a kingdom, and this kingdom sat at the very edge of a swamp. And in that swamp, down deep under the water, there was a dragon sleeping. And one day the dragon woke up, crawled out of the swamp, and went into the kingdom. And he caused all sorts of problems. He went through and he burned down crops, and he attacked people, and he ate people, and it was this huge fiasco. And the people in the kingdom, this dragon. So they all started talking, what can we do? They spoke with the wise men of the king, and people thought, could we slay it? And they thought, oh no, we can't do that. It's too strong, it's too frightening. So they decided to try a different experiment. They decided they would have the name of every single person in the entire kingdom go into a pot. And then the king, in front of all of his men, they would reach into the pot, reach out and pull a name. And whoever's name came out of that pot, that was the person they were going to feed to the dragon. So the kingdom got together, all the names went into a pot. He reached in, pulled out a name, and it was Princess Sabra, his daughter. Now suddenly the king kind of didn't like this idea so much anymore. And his advisors are like, hey, who was it? And he was like, it's the princess. And he starts talking with his advisors like, do we really have to do this? Can we do like 2 out of 3 or something? And the advisors are like, are you crazy? No. If it's not fair, if you try to spare your daughter, then no one's gonna go along with this anymore. It has to be fair. So he looks out at the crowd and he says, if anyone will go in her place, I'll give them half my kingdom and all this gold. And it was very quiet in the kingdom. It was kind of like when the teacher's calling on someone to answer a question, you don't look at her. It was like that. And so as he's sitting there, he's arguing with his people. The princess stands up and says, I'll do it. If it means saving our kingdom, I'll go be eaten by the dragon. So with a heavy heart, they tied the princess up and they took her off to the swamp to be killed. And everyone in the kingdom mourned because they loved their princess. She was kind, she was wise, she was wonderful, and her whole life she'd been preparing to be their queen. And now that their princess was gone, what were they going to do? Where was their future? So as the people are wailing and gnashing and, wringing their garments, who should arrive but St. George this night? And he asked the people, what's going on? Why is everyone so upset? And they said, oh, we have this dragon problem. And it's gotten so out of hand, now we have to give our only princess up to the dragon. And he says, well, has anyone tried to slay the dragon? And they say, well, no, because, this is a dragon we're talking about. It's huge, it has big orange eyes that are bloodshot, and it can breathe fire and smoke and spit poison. And if we try to fight it, we could die. So we've had to give our princess up. And St. George looked at these people that were crying and weeping and mourning the loss of their princess, and he says, we can't live like this. Someone should go slay that dragon. Now, as he's saying this, the king kind of slides into the conversation, and he says, hey, if you saved my daughter like 5 minutes ago, save my daughter, you can marry her and be the king when I die. And George said, okay, let's do this. So he got his lance and he got his steed, and he went off to face this dragon. Now, he went into the swamp. Now, it was early morning, and the mist was hanging low over the water. And as he walked through searching, he finally saw it crouching in the roots of an old willow tree. And when he saw it, it was so much worse than he thought it was going to be. This creature with its big orange eyes and its smoking maw dripping with venom, he saw it and he froze. He didn't move. He was like a prey animal staring down the nose of a wolf. He just froze up, and it started coming towards him. And as he was frozen, he couldn't move, he couldn't think, and he heard a voice, Sir Knight, over here. And he looks over, and the princess is standing there tied to a tree, and she says, here, take this. Takes off her belt, a girdle. She takes it and she throws it to him, and he catches it, and he's like, what do I do with this? And she goes, do a thing. And he goes, okay. And so he looks at this monster coming towards him, he looks at what he has, and he gets a rope, and he ties it around the girdle, around the belt, and then he swung it like a lasso, and he threw it, and it landed a little far off from the dragon, and he pulled it back quick, and just as the dragon was getting its mouth open to breathe out a plume of fire, he threw that lasso one last time, and it slipped over the nose of the dragon and onto his neck, and he pulled it tight. The dragon stopped. He pulled the rope to the left. The dragon moved to the left. He pulled the rope to the right. The dragon moved to the right. And now he's got a dragon on a leash. He went over, he freed the princess, and they started walking back to the kingdom with this dragon on a leash like they were a couple walking their dog. Now that the people in the village were like, okay, he's gonna kill the dragon, it's fine, we'll never see the dragon again. They see the dragon walking up the street and they're like, George, you had one job, what are you doing? The dragon comes up the road and they're like, what are you doing? He goes, no, look, takes out his sword, chops off its head. And now George is king, and they live happily ever after. And that's the story of St. George and the dragon. Now, why are we talking about this? Let's talk about heroes, dragons, and archetypes. Now, stories about heroes slaying monsters are archetypal. Now, what does that word archetypal mean? Well, archetypes are universal symbols and themes found within stories. Archetypes can be characters, like the wise old mentor, like the Gandalf or something, and the innocent maiden and the tyrant king. Those are all archetypes. But they could also be themes, like a hero facing a monster, sacrificing his life only to be reborn as Gandalf the White or something. And you also have stories of heroes slaying dragons. Now, there are a lot of archetypes, and often they appear in mythological stories, and they happen in modern stories and in ancient stories. Now, this is Carl Jung. He was considered to be the father of analytical psychology, and he developed this theory of archetypes and the collective unconscious. Now, it's a little complicated, but I'll give you the basic rundown of what that is. He believed that these types of archetypes existed in so many stories and were universal because they represented psychological truths that all of us relate to, things that all of us feel deep down, things that have been relevant to humanity for thousands and thousands of years. And he also believed that by looking at an archetypal story and applying it to yourself, you could learn the tools to actually make improvements in your own life and help you overcome your own challenges. So let's look at this archetype of the dragon. Now, there are so many stories about dragons. Now, many of the dragons in these types of stories tend to represent challenges and problems. The kind of problems you kind of have to overcome because it's a dragon, it's huge. Things that are so big and so daunting, you either face them or you get consumed by them. So if that's the case, and in this story we just looked at, if George's dragon is in fact a problem or a challenge so big you either destroy it or it eats your princess, what can we learn about overcoming challenges from St. George? Well, the story starts out and the people have a problem so big that they don't know what to do about it, and they decide to live in the problem rather than trying to solve it. They won't face the dragon. Now, sometimes people choose to live in their problems instead of facing them. People do that all the time. We'd rather not face things that are frightening or cause anxiety. But by living with our problems rather than solving them, sometimes we end up sacrificing the princess for them. Now, what could this princess represent? Well, she's this ruler. She's going to be the ruler someday. She's kind, she's wise, she's this future that everyone's looking forwards to. Sometimes when you don't address problems, you end up having them run your lives, and you end up having to sacrifice some desired future to it. So then George shows up, and what's George like? Well, he's not like all the people in the town that are living in the problem. He looks at the situation and he says, hey, we can't live like this. We've got to solve the problem. So he decides rather than living with the problem, rather than sacrificing things we value to the problem, he's going to go out and he's going to try to solve it. But when he sees that dragon, what happens? He freezes up. He does nothing. And sometimes that's how we react when we run into problems. Sometimes you run into a problem and it's so much worse than you thought it was. And you freeze up and you wonder, what could happen? Do I dare? Do I dare to do this? Now, oftentimes we avoid paying attention to things that cause us anxiety. We do that a lot. We want to look anywhere but at the problem itself. But oftentimes the things that we're afraid to let ourselves see are exactly the things we have to look at in order to grow. So the wise princess gives George the girdle to tame the dragon. He lassos it and eventually he slays it. And then George becomes king. Now, the hero is someone that notices a problem and he knows it's stopping them from being happy, so he goes out and he tries to stop it. So he faces the problem, he overcomes it, he gets the reward. So why are we talking about this? Well, you're the hero of your own story, right? We're all heroes of our own stories. And everyone kind of has problems, things we have to deal with in each and every day, problems, challenges, things that come up which prevent us from getting what we want. All of us have problems, and we don't get to choose what those problems are, but we do get to choose how we respond to them. Now remember, you have problems, you are not the problem. Sometimes when people have a lot of problems, they start to blame themselves and think, I'm the problem, I'm causing all these issues, what's wrong with me? And that's not the right attitude. You have problems, but you're not the problem. You're the hero that goes about solving problems. And you're not meant to be the side character in someone else's story either, nor are you the villain of someone else's story. You're the hero of your own story. The hero faces their challenges and they overcome them and they rescue their futures, the future they actually want to have. And then maybe they make the world a better place in doing so. So in order to be the person you really want to be and do the things you really want to do, you have to be brave enough to take risks. You can't hide out. Because the hero has something of value to offer the world. Now there's something weird about dragons. Let's look at this dragon. In this illustration, what's the dragon guarding? Gold, treasure. Yeah, valuables. And Fafnir the dragon, that's right. And that's kind of weird because what is a dragon going to do with gold? Does he have a 401k? Does he exchange goods and or services? What is this dragon doing? Hoarding, yeah? Now, if indeed this dragon represents a problem, then maybe after you face your problems, there's a reward on the other side of the challenge. Because oftentimes the things we have to face are the things that are preventing us from being happy. So in order to get the prize, you have to defeat the problem. Now consider the following quote. The cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek. What might that mean? Well, sometimes the things we're afraid of are exactly what we're supposed to be paying attention to become our better selves or to have the lives we want to have. Let's say you have a dream. You've always wanted to be an actor and act on stage, and you've been dreaming about it your whole life, and one day a call to adventure comes along, tryouts for the school play, and you think, this is my moment, and you go over to the sign-up sheet, and you go to sign your name, and you stop, and you think, do I dare? What if I try out and I don't get in? What if I go up there and I try out and the director says, beat it, kid, you have no future, you're not any good at this? What if you fail? Or what if you do get in, and then when you're on that stage in front of all those people under the hot lights, you freeze up because it's so much worse than you thought it was going to be, and you do nothing, and you forget all your lines and you make a fool of yourself and you let everyone down? What if you fail? And some people, when faced with that, they think, I'm just going to put it off. Maybe I'll try out next year. Fear is one of the biggest things that stops people from doing what they really want to do and being who they really want to be. But maybe you don't let that stop you. Maybe you do sign up and you do get in, and you do perform, and then you do really well. And at the end of the night, you get a standing ovation. And as you're standing there under those hot lights before the roar of the crowds, you are not the same person you were when you stood before that sign-up sheet wondering, do I dare? You are forever changed. Because overcoming challenges changes you in a fundamental way. Psychologists have discovered something interesting about willingly facing your fears. When a person chooses to face the things they're afraid of, but things they know they should face, they change. It's not that their fear decreases, it's that their courage increases. The strongest parts of a person that lies sleeping wake up and they face the challenge head on. And you discover very quickly that you are made of stronger stuff than you thought you were. So what could you be if you chose to really try? What could you do if you didn't let fear stop you from being who you want to be? Sometimes it takes having the courage to be vulnerable. Now, if you want to become the person you really want to be, you have to have the courage to let yourself be vulnerable. And in order to have courage, you have to first be afraid. And that sounds kind of weird, doesn't it? Well, what is courage? What does that mean? If you don't know you could be hurt, does it take any courage at all to take a risk? Well, no. Courage is knowing that you could fail, that you're not perfect and you still have a long way to go. It's knowing that in facing challenges you could get hurt, but then you do it anyway. You decide that what you stand to gain is more important than what you stand to lose. Because anything in life worth doing requires you to take on risks. And if things don't challenge you, then they don't change you. So in order to overcome obstacles, you have to be willing to make yourself vulnerable and run the risk of failure. So I'm speaking in a room full of people I don't know about dragons and self-improvement and stuff. There are a lot of lists out there of the biggest fears people have polls. And at the very top, what do you think's at the very top? Public speaking. It goes like this. There's death, and then there's public speaking. So there are people in this world that would rather die than talk in front of a crowd of people they don't know. And I'm a very shy person. And I could have very easily hid in my office this entire OddCon and avoided all of you. But I chose to speak anyway. Now there's a risk in that because I know that despite my best efforts, one of you might not like what I have to say. And when that happens, you might take a sip of your soda, put it down, take a deep breath and go, boo! And then it'll be like that scene in like Princess Bride or whatever, and that'd be horrible. Now, it's not unlikely that's going to happen, but it's not 0%. And the fact that I just told you I have that fear just increased that a lot. Like someone's like, I'm gonna ruin this girl's whole day and like hold my soda. Yeah. But there's a question you ask yourself whenever you're gonna do something hard, and that question is what I stand to gain more important to me than what I stand to lose? Is the life I could have or the person I could be on the other side of that challenge or struggle worth the risk and the sacrifice and the price I might have to pay? And every time you're running into a challenge that you don't know if you can overcome, you have to ask yourself that. And the thing is, nobody can answer that question for you. You have to answer it for yourself. Do I dare, and is it worth it? Who's writing your story? Now, Carl Jung, he once said, the most important question anyone can ask is, what myth am I living? And you can change that word myth for story. If everyone's living a story, do you know what story you're living? Who's writing it? Now, every choice you make, big or small, impacts your trajectory of where you go. But you're not always conscious of what choices you make and where they lead you. Most people go with the flow. They don't think too much about where their choices are leading them. But that's an important question to ask. Carl Jung once said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. And we'll look into what that means a little bit more later. So you have to ask yourself, are my choices leading me towards who I want to be, or are they leading me towards who I don't want to be? And more importantly, if you are indeed the hero of your own story, does your story get to have a happy ending? Welcome to Dragon Slaying 101. We're talking about problem solving so that you can have the life you want to have and be the person you want to be. Let me tell you a story. Once upon a time, when my niece was very, very young, I went to go visit her house, and I walked in to find my niece with her bicycle in the living room. And that was an odd sight. Here's how she was set up. She was sitting in the living room. She had her helmet on, and her knee pads, and her shoulder pads, and her mouth guard, and all these things. And on the ground, she had all of these pillows and couch cushions, and a little halo around her, this little pocket of safety. And she had her bicycle, and she had her hand against the wall, and she would pull up her feet, and she would let go of the wall and hold on to the bike. And then she would start wobbling. She would go, whoa, and she would hold the wall really quick. And then she would try it again, and she would try to bounce, and she'd hold the wall again. And I came over and I said, what are you doing? And she looked at me and she grinned and said, I'm learning to ride a bicycle. And I said, oh. Well, you know, we've got a park right across the street. You know, I could talk to your parents, I could take you out and teach you how to ride on the sidewalk. And she went, no, that's okay. I'm just gonna stay in here for a little while. So I kind of pushed back and talked a little bit with her, and she finally admitted, well, the last time I was out on my bike in the road, I crashed, and I skinned my knees. So I'm gonna stay in here and learn how to balance first, and once I've got that figured out, then I'll go out on the road. And that was her plan. What's wrong with my niece's plan? Yeah, it's nearly impossible to balance yourself on a bicycle when you're standing completely still. But she was scared because she'd fallen once before, yeah? No risk. Sometimes fear of failure halts our progress. We all kind of do that sometimes. Now imagine you're someone you're like, I really want a boyfriend or a girlfriend. That's something I've always wanted. But maybe you've struggled in dating. Maybe you've had some bad experiences. And then one day your roommate comes up and says, hey, my girlfriend and I are going to the movies, and she's got this roommate. Do you want to double date with us? And you say, no, that's okay. I'm very busy being alone in my room, watching YouTube and eating hot Cheetos. But don't worry, sometimes when I think about it, I watch a video about dating advice. I'm good. Sometimes we do that when dealing with challenges in our own life. Sometimes we avoid challenges altogether because we've been hurt before. We don't want to be hurt again. So we want to make progress in a zero-risk environment. And we might, fool ourselves into thinking we're making progress when in reality, maybe we're just sitting still. And that's not a good long-term solution. So growth requires forward momentum. You can't balance on a bicycle when you're sitting still. And you can't become the person you're meant to be by stubbornly insisting you stay exactly the way you are. All growth doesn't happen when you're safe and secure surrounded by your pillows. It happens out there in that eye of the storm and whatever challenge that maybe you've been hiding from yourself for a long time. You have to pick up your helmet, you have to get your courage, and you have to go back on the road. Get on your bike and pedal as fast as you can, knowing full well you could fall and you could fail. But you keep pedaling because maybe you learn to balance yourself along the way. But that's a lesson everyone has to learn on their own. The next thing I want to talk about is mistakes. You actually learn more from correcting your mistakes than you do from succeeding. Now, people always say, oh, you learn more from failure than you learn from success, but I think there's more to it than that. When you're starting a new skill, do you ever kind of expect yourself to be perfect the first time? How often are you actually perfect the first time? Maybe the second of February or something? It doesn't happen. So when you expect yourself to be perfect and you inevitably fail, what does that do? Well, you kind of do this. You're sitting there and you're in your comfort zone and you're like, what if I left my comfort zone? And you leave and you get pulverized by reality. And then you go back in and what happens? You build up an even stronger wall and you're like, I'm never doing that again. Yeah, so we get embarrassed and we retreat. But by giving up, we miss out on something crucial about the learning process. Now, if all you ever learn from making mistakes is that I should not try anything ever because that's painful, then we don't learn that much from making mistakes. That's one of the reasons I say you learn more from correcting your mistakes than you do from success. So the things that you practice actually build little machines in your brain. You're always trying to get better at what you do. So the more you practice something, the more your brain tries to automate that. Now, some of the new challenges you face might be skills-based, and if you don't have the skills yet, if you haven't built that little machine, then it's unrefined. So of course, it doesn't work out the first time. Now imagine you really like Mario. You're like, I love video games, let's draw Mario. And you've never really drawn Mario before. Think you're automatically going to be good at it? Probably not. So there's a lot of skill that goes into drawing. Now what's interesting about drawing is it's a lot like being a person. Because there is no such thing as a perfect artist, like there is no such thing as a perfect person, and you're always learning and improving. So when you're playing Mario Kart with your friends, you've seen Mario a million times, but you ever stop and go, oh, the ovals of Mario's eyes are an eye width apart, and they sit along the horizontal midline of the sphere of his cranium, and when his head is at a 3/4 view, his nose covers a little over half of the far eye. Like, do you ever do that? Like, if you were sitting with your friends playing Mario Kart and you said that, what are your friends gonna say? They're like, dude, what are you talking about? Just play the game. That's not relevant to playing the game. So people have selective focus. Your brain has to filter out so many things all the time. You can't focus on everything because it's too much. And so you have to be selective. So you filter out what information is most important to you. So if you haven't practiced a skill, you're not going to be great at it automatically. You have to practice it. Now sometimes when we try something new and we're not very good at it, we kind of start to get discouraged because what's in our head doesn't match what we created. So consider this doodle. Someone drew Mario for the first time. This is how they did. And you can tell this was probably the kind of thing they were trying to draw. But it's unrefined. It's a first attempt. So how could they improve? Well, the first thing they have to do is they have to learn how to recognize when they've made a mistake. Now, I've said before, learning how to draw is a lot like learning how to be a person. And nobody ever fully gets there. It's a constant process. So when you find out you're making mistakes you want to improve, you have to get better at recognizing when you make a mistake. So you think, okay, how far apart are his eyes here? They're that far. How far apart are they on the reference? They're only that far. So maybe you have to go in and you have to redraw and remeasure. And this process may take many attempts because every time you correct it, you might be off in a new way. But every time the artist self-corrects and makes a genuine attempt to measure and change, the brain is getting better at seeing proportion and placement and drawing more accurately. So they start building that little machine to improve. And the more you practice, the better you get at doing it. So in the future, maybe you recognize mistakes quicker and you make fewer mistakes. By redrawing, the brain gets better at communicating with your hands to draw accurately. So you learn more by noticing and correcting your mistakes than you do by just getting it right the first time or giving up when it becomes challenging. It's the self-correcting that builds the neural pathways. So mistakes are an essential part of learning. Now, I've been doing art for a long time. I've done it professionally and as a hobby. I've done it for magazines. And I decided I'm going to draw Mario for the first time. I'd never drawn Mario before. And I want to show you what that's like. So I filmed myself drawing Mario. Now, imagine I've been doing this for 20 years. You'd expect I'd be good at it, right? I don't know. What do you notice about this process? So I got started. I started tracing over. I figured out some proportions. I found out, okay, where's the ear supposed to go? I made a slope. I started mapping out based on the reference where things go. And then after I kind of got some of that figured out, I took the reference away or the drawing away, and I started trying to refine my lines. But the new lines weren't correct either, so I had to draw them again. And every time you draw an area wrong, all the other areas you're looking at to compare it to are also wrong. So it's this slow process of fixing over and over and over again. But every time you do it, you get a little bit closer to what it's supposed to be. And eventually, over time, as you're refining and redefining each of those lines, you slowly get closer to what it's actually supposed to look like. So eventually, after I've drawn these eyes for maybe 30 different times, it finally starts to look like Mario. But it didn't look like that in the beginning. Not even close. So nobody's perfect the first time. Everyone makes mistakes. And that's really important to realize that that's how learning works. So whenever you try to learn a new thing, you make an attempt. And that attempt is usually way off. And so you go, oh no, let me self-correct. And when you self-correct, sometimes you overcorrect. And so you're wrong in a new way. And you go, oh no. You try again and you're wrong in a new way. Oh no. And you keep finding new and fantastic ways to fail over and over. But each time you do it, you start jumping closer and closer to what you're trying to get at. And then eventually you hit it. And that's how all learning kind of happens. So if that's true, why do we put so much high expectations on our own performance? Why do people give up and get embarrassed when things get hard? So there's something called a work in progress. Now I'll tell you a secret. I used to really hate letting people watch me draw. Who here is an artist? Do you have any artists here today? Now, how many of you who are an artist, you're sitting there drawing or doing a painting or a sculpture, and someone's walking by and they stop and they go, oh, art's happening. And then they stand behind you. And they don't say anything, they just stare. I don't like that. Someone's laughing, they know how that feels. It's a really, really scary thing because the process is you're gonna make a ton of mistakes before it starts looking good. And a lot of times we don't like people to see our mistakes. We really don't like people seeing the ways in which we aren't living up to what we're trying to do. That's really hard. If you ever look at Instagram, people are putting out their best selves. They're trying to put forth this image of a perfect life, and no one actually has that life, not even the person putting up the picture. So a lot of people, they really don't like other people seeing when they're struggling, especially when they're struggling. Who's ever had a class in school that was really hard, and it started to stress you out a little bit, and then you started falling behind in it, and then you didn't do the homework, and you were like, oh man, I didn't do the homework. I don't want to show up and have to explain to the teacher why I didn't do the homework. I just won't show up. And so you skip that day. And then there's more homework and you skip the next day. And the more you skip, the more anxious you get about that class. And then one day your mom's walking down the hall and she goes, hey, how's that one class going? Do you want to talk about that class, or do you want to make a new door out that wall like the Kool-Aid man to get away from her? You want to escape. She's like, do you want to talk about your problems? And you're like, oh no, and you bump out that wall, you are gone, because no one wants to see the ways in which they're failing. It's a really scary thing to do. But there's also something in art called a work in progress. And a work in progress is where even though you're struggling, you show every step of your process, and you let the world see that, because there's some value in that. Because the reality is there is no such thing as a perfect artist as there is no such thing as a perfect person. Everyone's trying to figure things out. But it's the willingness to keep learning and improving that makes the difference. So when you're struggling with a new challenge, don't think of yourself as the finished product. Think of yourself as the work in progress. And think, okay, I'm not everything I could be yet, but I'm shaping up. I'm refining and redefining myself every day, and one day I'm going to be the masterpiece. But it's okay just to let yourself be the work in progress. That's normal. That's what it means to be human. So comparison is the thief of happiness. How often when you're struggling do you compare yourself to someone who's not struggling the same way? That's a rough place to be. Sometimes we think that people are great or automatically great, and that we don't see the process they went through. Now, everyone has unique strengths and struggles, and it's not fair to compare yourself to other people. So here's unrealistic expectation versus reality. What's unrealistic expectation?
I'm a human, you assuming I'm a human. What I gotta do to get it through to you, I'm superhuman.
Have you ever had a dreams that you want him to do you so much you could do anything?
So you're not rap God when you try something new. You're not just amazing. You mess up a million times before you get there, and that's normal, and that's okay. Let's talk about Carl Rogers. Now, Carl Rogers was a psychologist. He was one of the founders of the humanistic approach and the person-centered approach of psychology. And he believed that there are two things a patient must do before they go to therapy, or that therapy would not have any effect at all. Two things that had to happen. Number one, the patient had to admit that they had a problem. And two, the patient had to have a desire and willingness to actually try to solve that problem. And that had to happen, or the therapy wouldn't have any effect. And why is that? Well, if someone can't even admit they have a problem, what's there for them to solve in therapy? And if they know they have a problem but they're not willing to solve it, then they're not going to solve anything. Because people don't change unless they want to change, and you can't help someone that does not want to be helped. And those rules are true for pretty much everything in life, not just therapy. In order to overcome any challenge in your life, you have to be willing to do these two things. You have to be willing to admit you have a problem, and you have to actually have a real desire and willingness to try to solve it. Because you have the power to make a change, but challenges have to be faced willingly, because people only change if they want to change. Let's explore that a little bit deeper. I like memes. Who's seen this meme before? Yeah. So this little dog is in a burning building, but rather than trying to escape the flames, he sits quietly sipping his tea. This dog is trying to live in the problem. They can see the flames, but they're pretending it's not happening. Do you ever do that? Do you ever deal with your problems by pretending you don't have problems? I think we all do that from time to time. Now, what are some of the reasons we might avoid solving problems? Well, there's fear. If I try to put out the fire, I could get hurt. There's feeling overwhelmed. There's just so much fire, I don't even know where to begin to get it under control. There's uncertainty about the problem. Is my house really on fire, or is it just really, really hot in here? Denial. This isn't so bad. Maybe I could live like this for the rest of my life. And technically, you could live in a burning building for the rest of your life, but it would be a very short, painful life. Well, there's ineffective coping strategies. Okay, maybe if I open up all the windows and let the smoke go out, the fire will go away. Now, there's procrastination. I'm so busy. I'll put out the flames later when I have more time. There's anxiety and avoidance. Every time I think about the fire, I get so anxious and upset, so I don't think about the fire. There's lack of skills. Oh, who am I kidding? I don't know the first thing about putting out a fire. Maybe I'll wait until I learn some fire safety, which I'll look up later when I have time. There's embarrassment. Who am I kidding? I'm not a firefighter. What if I try to put it out and I do it wrong and I make a fool of myself in front of my neighbors? There's shame. If I admit that my house is on fire, what does that say about me as a person? Neurotic victimhood. This is a big one. Why should I put out the fire? It's not my fault it happened. If the people who made my house hadn't made it so gosh darn flammable, and if microwave popcorn wasn't so easy to burn, I wouldn't have burned my house down. So I'm going to complain about fire and houses and popcorn, because if I complain loud enough, maybe the world will change and the fire will go away. Yep. Any minute now. Nihilism. What's the point in even trying? Nothing matters anyway. Helplessness. I'm trapped. I'll never escape. You kind of have to get to this point, right? You kind of have to be able to say, okay, this is not fine and I can't live this way. The first step to solving any problem is admitting I have a problem, but then what? Now, the admission can stop the problem from growing further, but it doesn't solve the problem outright. That's just the first step. Now, it's hard to admit you have a problem because then you actually have to do something. You can't just sit there sipping your tea while your life burns down before your eyes. You have to act. And that can be overwhelming because you might not know what to do. Uncertainty can just be as terrifying as a dragon, even more so sometimes. Sometimes people choose to live in their problems because of all the fear and uncertainty that would come with facing the problem. I think that's why some people choose to stay in abusive situations. They know it's not healthy. They know they're not happy. They know they're miserable. But they'd rather stay with someone that makes them feel miserable than have to go out and face the world alone. And that's a rough place to find yourself. People can become prisoners of their problems very easily. They'd rather stay where things are certain but bad than to try to save themselves and maybe make things worse. And that's what it means to be disempowered or discouraged. It means the power and the courage to act has been taken from you. But that can only happen if you let it happen. Nobody can disempower you without your consent, and if you want to be empowered again, you have to choose to be empowered again. So the first step to solving a problem is admitting you have a problem. Now, this is an interesting story. This is a story that's been around for a long time. I tried to find who wrote it, and I could not, because everyone had reposted it from somewhere else. Once upon a time, there was a man who had never been to a circus before. And he's like, you know what, I'm 35. I'm just going to go to a circus. I don't need an occasion. And he went to the circus. And as he's sitting there, his eyes are aglow with childlike wonder. This is amazing. He sees people on flying trapezes and elephants on parade and people jumping through flaming hoops and all of these amazing things. And by the end, he's excited. And as people are packing up, he goes to the ringleader and says, hey, that was great. Can you show me more? And the guy goes, yeah, we're just packing up to go to Cincinnati, but you can hang out with us. And he goes, cool. So he gets up and he walks around back, and they're packing up the stage, and the lions are off in cages, and the clowns are probably smoking or something. And he turns around the corner and he goes, whoa, there's an elephant. And the elephant is not in a cage. The elephant is standing there, and there's a little peg in the ground with a rope tied to the peg and around its leg. And he's concerned about this, and he says, are you going to put the elephant in his cage? And the man says, oh, no, he's fine. And the man says, well, I'm sure you already know this, but can't the elephant just pull up the stick and walk away? And the man says, well, sure he could, but he won't. And the man goes, what? And then the guy leaned in like he was going to tell him something kind of cool, and he says, when that elephant was a baby, we used that same rope and that same peg. We tied him up. Now, he didn't like that very much. And every night the elephant tried to get out, so he would push and pull and strain and try to get the peg out. But back then, the elephant was so small that it could keep him there. And every day, for weeks and weeks, he tried to get out, but he couldn't. And then eventually, a little light switch flicked off in the elephant's brain, and it thought, oh, this must be an immovable object. I guess I'll never escape. And it stopped trying. Now, as the elephant grew up, they kept using the same rope and the same peg, but the elephant never tried to get out again. It wasn't the peg that kept it prisoner, but his own belief that it was impossible. Now, you hear that story and you might think, wow, I thought elephants were a lot smarter than that. Or, I guess that's a cool story. What does it have to do with me? And the answer to that is everything. This story has everything to do with you. Because many people are just like that elephant, held back by self-doubt, by things they could easily change. They know what their weaknesses are, but they don't know their strengths. Like the elephant, how many of us are held back in life by previous failures? So maybe you've had an experience like the elephant before. Maybe there's something you wish you could change about yourself or your situation. Maybe it was a class in school you struggled with or a skill you never thought you'd master. And you tried your hardest again and again, but you still failed. And that's really painful. It's really hard to watch yourself fail over and over. It's disheartening, and maybe one day you thought, okay, this must be an immovable object. Maybe I'll never get out. So what's the worst thing you can say to someone? Now, there are a lot of bad things you can say to someone, but the very worst thing I think is to take their weaknesses, their fears, their flaws and insecurities and shortcomings, whether they're real or imagined, and tell them they'll never change. To look at them and say, you're X. You've always been X and you're always going to be X. So imagine someone came up to me and I was like, hey, how'd you like the show? And they're like, guess what, Katie? And I say, what? And they say, you're stupid. You've always been stupid and you're always going to be stupid. Bye, Katie. And I say, bye. Well, okay then. That's horrible. That's one of the worst things you can say to someone, because where do you go from there? There's no way out of that. Now, there's only one thing worse than saying that to someone else, and it's saying it to yourself and believing it. So let's say you really want to run a marathon, but you've never run more than a mile without puking your guts out before. And then one day you look at yourself and you say, hey, I'm slow. I've always been slow, I'm always going to be slow. That's how we create pegs for ourselves. We decide that because we failed at something once before, or even many times before, that we will always fail. Now, the problem with that thinking is that it's a lie, because no one ever stays the same forever. Your abilities aren't set in stone. Elephants grow, limits do not. You're not merely something that is, you are something that changes and grows and improves. With every success that brings you high and with every failure that brings you low, you're always changing, always growing like the elephant. There aren't really any real limits. Now, how tragic is it to look at something as powerful as an elephant held back by something so small? We have to ask ourselves, how do they not realize they have the power to change? I think sometimes it's because change comes slowly. You ever been a kid and they sit you against the wall to measure you and they put a line above your head to see how much you grew? And at first you're thinking, I don't think I grew that much, I haven't changed too badly. And then when you step back, you realize, oh, I was changing the whole time. I didn't realize. So things that once seemed hard won't always be. And as you grow and change, things that were once daunting will seem smaller. And the truth is, the peg never changes. It's always the same little peg with the same rope and the same spot of dirt. What changes is you. You have to rise to the occasion, because we're all like the elephant. There's nothing that can hold you back except for the things that you give that power to. You're in charge of your future. You have the power to pull up whatever pegs might be holding you back and stopping you from being who you want to be. You have to take responsibility for your own life. I like this meme. Once upon a time, this man is driving along on his bike, and he has this fantastic idea to take a stick and put it into the spokes of his bike. And then, of course, what happens? He goes flipping over the bike, and what does he say when he flips over the bike? Ah, curse you, universe, you made me fall. Okay, so did the universe actually make this guy fall? You could say gravity did, but who put the stick in his spokes? He did. Now, we do that a lot. People do this a lot. Sometimes we make choices and we don't realize what those choices are doing, how they're affecting us. So sometimes we actually sabotage ourselves. And often it's a lack of introspection. Rather than looking inwards to see what am I doing, you look outwards and you find someone to blame. Now, it's actually really easy to blame other people when things go wrong in your life, but it's not always useful. Because one day, you might get up and you might be like, I'm going for a bike ride, and the universe better not mess with me, okay? Okay, I'm gonna get my stick. And then you do it again. And you might be doomed to repeat the same problems again and again forever, and that's not a good way to live. I just barely did this, actually. I was on vacation over the last weekend. And early in the morning, I got up, and as I was beginning my day, my face was itchy. And my eyes were puffy and bloodshot. And I was like, what's happening? Am I allergic to something? And I went through my day, and I was miserable the whole day. And I kept thinking, oh, it must be the pollen in the air. It must be springtime springing at me. And I was so upset. And at night, as I took a shower, it went away. And I was like, oh, I must be getting better. Next day, I got up, got ready. It happened again. And then it got better when I took a shower. And it happened for 3 days. And then I realized one morning as I was putting on my makeup, it was my sunscreen. I bought a new thing of sunscreen that was specifically made for faces. There was an ingredient I was allergic to, and I was making myself sick every day and making my time awful. But because I was looking at everything else, I wasn't seeing how my own behaviors were making it happen. So this happens. I did it, gang. I finally figured out the person who's been messing up my life and causing me problems. Oh. Let's be honest, we all do this more than we like to admit. So who's really in control of your happiness and success? Who's responsible for your happiness? Well, you're responsible for your own happiness and success. So here's a tip. If you ever find yourself saying, well, I would be happier if my parents would just, or I would have succeeded in school if only my teachers would have just, or I would have had a great job if only my boss or coworkers would have just, or any similar phrase that pushes responsibility for your success and happiness onto someone else's shoulders, take a mental step back. Now for me, I have to give myself a mental slap because I am very, very stubborn. Because it's not other people's responsibility for you to have the life you want to have. Now, taking responsibility for your own life can be really hard, especially if you've suffered in the past or had hard times and things haven't always been nice for you. So maybe you were born with a unique set of struggles, or maybe you have burdens that other people haven't had to carry. Maybe you have flaws and weaknesses that come up again and again throughout your life and have prevented you from getting what you want. Maybe you did something bad, or maybe someone did something bad to you and it wasn't your fault and you didn't deserve it. Maybe you're someone that's had to swim in deep waters your whole life and you feel like you've spent years just trying to keep your head above water. And that's a really rough place to find yourself. You don't have to take responsibility for what other people have done, nor should you. But it's important to take responsibility for your own choices. Take responsibility for what you can change and what you can control, not for what you can't control and what you can't change. Then you have to forgive yourself. You can't control what happened in the past, but you can control what you do in the present. Now, if you want to heal, you have to take responsibility for your own mental health and happiness. And you have to do what's good for yourself in the long run and make choices that lead towards something good. Now, think of it this way. If your excuse for not living a happy, fulfilling life is that someone in the past hurt you, what are you actually doing? Well, you're taking the power to decide if you get to be happy out of your own hands and putting it in someone else's hands. And why would you ever want to do that? Why would you want to give someone else the power to decide if you get to be happy, especially if you don't think that person has your best interest at heart? Now, oftentimes, that choice to give away your control happens unconsciously. People do it all the time. But as Carl Jung observed, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and maybe you'll call it fate. But it doesn't have to be that way. You only get one life. And it's your responsibility to either love that life or change that life. There's a scene in Lord of the Rings. Frodo's been asked to carry this ring, this heavy burden. And if he doesn't do it, no one will. And he's down in Moria, which is an awful, awful place full of dead dwarves, and the Balrog, who's like Satan, is down there doing whatever. And so it's a horrible place, and he's really overwhelmed. And he looks at Gandalf and says, "I wish the ring had never come to me. I wish that none of this had ever happened." And Gandalf says, "So do all who live to see such times, but that's not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what we will do with the time that is given to us." Sometimes we're made to carry heavy loads, and we don't get a say in what those loads are. And we don't have control over other people either. But all we have to do is to decide what we're going to do with our life. What are we going to do with the things that we've been given, with the cards we've been dealt? Now, it's a really scary thing to consider, but there's real hope in it. Because when you take responsibility for your own life, you're empowered to pilot your own destiny. You can do the things you want to do. And you can look at yourself and actually take stock. You can look at all those bad experiences you've had, all of the trials, the mistakes, the weaknesses, the pains you've been carrying around for so long. You can actually look at them and realize maybe you don't have to carry them anymore. Maybe the pains of the past can be left behind you, and you don't have to be a slave of old ways of thinking and being that don't serve you anymore. And once you find the courage to start moving forwards, you find out you are a lot stronger than you thought you were. There's more to you than you ever thought was there. And when you realize that, you're one step closer to being who you want to be. Because human beings are not small, meager things pretending at greatness, but sleeping giants dreaming they are small. Here's the most important message I have for you, and the last message. You are a hero on a mission. Where does your self-worth come from? Does it come from how many followers you have online? I hope not. Does it come from your youth and beauty? Well, that'll be gone in 30 years. Does it come from your intelligence, from your wealth, from your prestige, from your accomplishments? It shouldn't come from any of those things, because those things are fleeting. Your self-worth doesn't come from your youth. It doesn't come from your beauty, your intelligence, your grade, your IQ, or anything. You are a human being. You are infinitely valuable. Period. Even if you don't see it yet, even if you're scared, even if you've made a mistake, even if you didn't do something that you were supposed to do, you are infinitely valuable. Period. If you want to love yourself, you have to treat yourself like someone you actually think matters. You have to believe in that future that you want to have. Who do you think you could be if you treated yourself like someone you actually thought mattered? Someone whose future you actually believed in, and then you acted accordingly? What kind of life could you have? What kind of world would we be in? What could you do for the world if you chose to really try? to really be the best you could be. Now, struggle is a universal human experience. Each of us faces unique challenges, and we don't always get a say in what those challenges are. But what really matters is what we choose to do in the face of adversity. To face your dragons head on is an act of heroism. You might not save the whole world, but even if the only life you save is your own, it's worth it. Because each and every one of you has something of value to offer this world. You have unique gifts and talents and a voice all your own that you have to choose to use. And right there, out there in the world, there are people you could be helping, things you could be doing, lives you could be enriching, dragons you could be slaying, rights you could be wronging, wrongs you could be righting, and innovations you could be making. But you have to rise to the occasion, because whether you realize it or not, the world is a much better place with you in it. Thank you for your time.